Hi, welcome to the next talk on culture, foreign policy and society in times of change. My name is Caroline Jill. It's great that you're here and you're joining us for a next talk about Ukraine, about what Ukraine means to the world and the current challenges. I'm today in Kiev talking with Volodymyr Yermolenko.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
It's a great pleasure to meet you in Kiev.
Great pleasure for me.
One day after the Day of Independence of Ukraine. Volodymyr, you are a philosopher, you're expert, you're head of Ukraine World. This is a multimedia project on Ukraine, and you're doing like a lot of things to promote Ukraine in the world. And I already mentioned that yesterday Ukraine celebrated its 30th anniversary of independence. So 24th of August 1991, Ukraine got its independence, proclaimed its independence from Soviet Union. But until now, there are like people who question the independence, doubt the independence, not only in 1991, but also nowadays. So perhaps you can explain us why Ukraine as a nation did not come out of the blue.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. Thanks for talking, because we are always, it's very important for us Ukrainians to reach out to the world. And Ukraine, indeed, I remember my friend Andrew Wilson published a wonderful book, Ukraine, Unexpected Nation. I think it is worth mentioning that it was unexpected, maybe for the world, but not for us, for Ukrainians, because there is a deeper story of Ukrainian independence. First, we don't say that Ukraine got independence in 91, because we are saying rather that it was a renewed independence. And if you followed yesterday's speech from the president, all other stuff which surrounded this event, we always talking about renewal of independence. Why renewal? Because Ukraine was independent in the early 20th century, from the 1917 to 2021. Well, it was a very short-lived independence, but it's very important because it was a sign, it was a time when empires collapsed, right? The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, maybe we can say the Second German Empire collapsed. So it created the nation states in Central and Eastern Europe. And the Russian Empire collapsed initially. So Ukraine could have been like Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary at the time. But the Russian Empire quickly re-established itself in the form of Soviet Union. So that independence didn't survive then. But the traces of independence, we keep them. Ukraine, you could say that it was also independent in the 17th century, when we had, after the 30 Years' War in Europe, Ukraine emerged in 1648, 1654 as a kind of a quasi-independent nation, and it survived at least half of the century, at least in autonomous polity. Ukraine was a big state, or I would say the proto-Ukrainian statehood in the medieval times. So what we call the Kievan Rus, or what was called the Rus at the time. It was a very powerful state in the center of Kiev. And it was a gate, for example, for Eastern Christianity to enter the Eastern Slavic lands. So, it's a very deep history, and it's very remarkable how Ukrainians right now rediscover this history and are trying, to be at the same time a young nation, but with a very deep past.
What do you think the so-called West does not understand about Ukraine's independence?
Well, I would not put it in that way, like the West doesn't understand, or, well, there are many things that Ukrainians don't understand about the West or other countries, about Germany or about France. So it's like a mutual dialogue, and it's very important to have this mutual dialogue. I think there are some, of course, misunderstandings. So I think this story of very long Ukrainian struggle for freedom is largely unnoticed for different reasons. For example, I remember when one of the greatest Ukrainian writers and prime minister of that republic in the early 20th century, Volodymyr Yermolenko, who was, finding his place as an immigrant in Western Europe. He was surviving at a certain moment of time for a small scholarship given by Czechoslovakia at the time. And he was not interesting to anybody in Europe. So it was a mark how these Ukrainians emigres who lost the statehood were useless basically in this new world. And I think it is important for us to not to repeat this mistake, right? I think there is a misunderstanding, like there is a feeling in some Western countries, there is certain mistrust to these identity issues, like why Ukrainians are struggling for the language, for culture, etc. My response is that while in certain Western European states or America, there is a clear divide between the so-called identity politics and universal rights, universalist discourse, universalist human rights. In Ukraine is not that case, because the struggle for identity, national identity, like a political nation, not the ethnic nation, and the struggle for human rights is the same struggle for us. And for example, Ukrainian dissidents during the Soviet times are very important and also largely unnoticed in the world. So the world is talking very often about Russian dissidents like Solzhenitsyn or Sakharov, but there was a huge number of Ukrainian dissidents, of other dissidents in the Soviet Union, Georgian, Armenian, Jewish, etc. It's important to hear their voice too, because the struggle was at the same time for the rights of their community, of our community, and for the human rights, individual rights. Therefore, the dissident movement was around this Helsinki movement for human rights, etc. So Ukrainian movement, like it is often seen, well, when you see the Ukrainian movement, identity, it means far right, nationalist, whatever. It's not the case. Ukrainian movement in the 20th century was leftist, for example, in the years 1910, 1920s, as everywhere in the world. So many Ukrainian writers were actually leftist socialists or whatever. It was, of course, more to the right spectrum when all Europe was very far right, in the 30s. And it became very liberal starting from the 1960s, 1970s. And I would say that in today's Ukraine, when I've listened to the, for example, speech of President Zelensky, it's remarkable how I noticed his kind of a search for a kind of a compromise between patriotic values and liberal values.
So you've thought that, or when I understood correctly, that this speech was very soft of President Zelensky yesterday?
I think the speech was very good, actually.
What did you like about it?
Well, I think Zelensky is he came to presidency without, we all know this story, like a comedian or a businessman in the entertainment sector or a filmmaker came to the presidency. I think he didn't really understand what he was doing at the time, 2 years ago. And I think he's gradually moved, he's rather driven by the society. He's not a true driver of the society, but he has the feeling of listening to the society. And many things that, for example, he undervalued, underestimated 2 years ago, like he was thinking that it is very easy to end the war with Russia. He was thinking that he would easily.
This was one of his claims, right?
Yeah, he was thinking that he would easily talk with Putin and reach the agreement. Well, all the people with a little bit of understanding what is going on, and that current Russia is not really willing to any compromises with anybody in the world, were telling him that look, it is very naive, and I think he now understands that, and I think he's now. It's very interesting that in his rhetorics he is more and more resembling his predecessor, Mr. Poroshenko, although he's considering Poroshenko his personal enemy and etc. So, but the key thing I think is this kind of trying to find a balance between the idea of national security and national identity. When I say national, I mean not ethnic identity, but political identity, because he mentioned it is very right that Ukraine is, there are dozens of different ethnicities, nationalities, and they're all enriching this country. But to find a balance between the identity of a collective organism and human rights, individual rights, and it's so I would call it a balance between patriotism and liberalism.
President Zelensky mentioned also yesterday multiple times the Kievan Rus of Ukraine. I think this was what he was using, but of course it plays a very important role in the storytelling of Russia. So how Russia is influencing the other story of Ukraine?
So this concept Rus-Ukraine was actually not invention of present times. It was invented, I would say, by Ukrainian historians of the 19th and early 20th century. And one of the key politicians of that time, Mikhailo Hrushevsky, basically wrote a history of Rus-Ukraine, as it called it, Rusi-Ukraine. It's a very interesting topic, and we at Ukraine World have a book which is available for all readers online about history, in which we're discussing in detail, which Ukrainian historians discussing in detail all the issues. So the thing is that Rus was in the medieval times was rather a name for these lands around Kiev. And gradually, as we move to the modern times, what we are now calling Russia was expropriating this notion of Rus in a kind of translating it from the Greek, because the Greeks called these lands Russia, so it came to also to designate Russia. So of course, I think Ukrainians understand that Kievan Rus was not Russia, and it is very important also for the world to understand. It's like I always give this example to the Western Europeans, like look at the medieval map, for example, after the Carolingian Empire of Charles the Great collapsed, and then you would see at a certain moment of time the German lands called Eastern Francia. So it doesn't give you any idea to call like Germany French lands or whatever. So the names are changing, and it's a law of history that they are changing like this. And of course, if we talk about the medieval times, I think it's true to say that, of course, at that time, this polity Kievan Rus was actually a mixture of Scandinavian element, very important, because it was founded by the Vikings, actually. Scandinavian element and Eastern Slavic element and all the other elements. So it's a kind of nobody can expropriate it. Nobody can say that, well, this is only Ukraine, or this is only Russia, or this is only Sweden, or whatever. That's stupid in the 21st century. But it is true that Russia is also in a very tricky, I think, epoch of its history. It's trying to rebuild an empire. It doesn't feel itself as a nation state with clear-cut borders, etc. And empire, the logic of empire is always expansion. Empire doesn't have borders, actually. So when we've seen the war in Georgia in 2008, Russian aggression to Georgia, when we have seen the support of secessionism in Moldova, in Transnistria, when we see then in 2014 the occupation of Crimea, invasion in Donbass and Eastern Ukraine, this is part of the same story for us, kind of a willingness of Russia to re-establish its empire, and the metaphor which is still very popular among Ukrainians, I think, is that before annexing territories, it tried to annex history.
You mentioned history, but let's come back to 30 years of independence. I mean, 1/3 of this time period, almost 8 years. You have war in eastern Ukraine. You have in 2014 annexation of Crimea. So, what are the failures of Ukraine during this time of independence?
Well, I think it's the key failure is kind of inability to challenge the what I would say kind of a wild re-establishment of private interests and takeover of private interest over the public interests. So it's maybe very complicated, but if you look at what corruption is, what oligarchy means, all other stuffs, this is the same story of the private encroaching to the public, right? And when private interests take precedence over the public interests. Ukraine is a very interesting story in the Eastern Europe, for example, or Central and Eastern Europe, because it is very different from Russia, where you always have had this encroaching of public interests in private interests in the 90s, the rise of the Russian oligarchy. But then it was cracked down by Putin's regime, and they have built another authoritarian state. It's also very different from Belarus, where you didn't even have this story of the 90s. So the Belarusian oligarchy doesn't even exist, right? It was initially taken over by kind of a very communist politician, pro-communist politician, who is now a dictator. We know that, and a horrible, inhumane dictator. It's very different also from Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. I think Slovakia, it's naive to say that Ukraine was on the same level, had the same starting opportunities as Poland in 1991, 1990. Because for Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, whatever, was initially perceived by Europe as a kind of the European space. And the economic inflows in these countries became very quick from the Western Europe, right? Countries like Ukraine, I think they were considered by Western Europe, by United States, whatever, Soviet Union collapsed, but it's still Soviet Union. It's still some form of the Soviet Union. So you didn't have, therefore, a quick entrance of the global capital here, of the Western capital here. And if you have this, who would privatize all these, assets which were left from the Soviet Union if the Western capital doesn't come in? Of course, it will be local actors, either the remnants of the Communist Party or the new criminal elites, I would say. This is what happened. This is the birth of Ukrainian oligarchy, and of course now it's very, very difficult to combat it, because it's everywhere. It's in the judiciary system, it's in state sector, etc. So now the key task is to, tackle this oligarchic wild capitalism, which is a part of what we call corruption. Because when we talk about corruption, sometimes we didn't really enter the essence why it is that. Because the essence of this post-Soviet corruption is that while during Soviet Union we had complete domination of the public, collective, party-ruled, etc. From the 90s, we have a complete, like the other extreme, complete domination of the private interests over the public. So now I think the key thing is to rebuild somehow this importance of the public.
Do you think that President Zelensky is succeeding?
Not sure that he is succeeding, not sure that he really understands this question like that, but I think there is this understanding finally in the society. There is this request for the authorities to limit this encroaching private interests into the interests of state, of the public, so of the public sphere. And I think in this case, we are coming in parallel, sometimes it seems to me, with the rest of the world, because the rest of the developed capitalist world is experiencing the same trends. since the 80s at least. So when the public institutions cannot really tackle the private interests, when they're not that strong to tackle big corporations, big private interests, big money, etc. It's a different game, but it's somehow the same game. So how you reinstall the public interests? And in Ukraine there is a process, like you have this creation of the public service broadcaster, who needs to be a kind of a public interest institution. You see what I have seen yesterday on the parade, etc. I've seen the kind of in the rhetoric that, look, we need to, for example, we have good enterprises, aviation building enterprises, like we have world champions in this aviation, like Mria, which is the biggest airplane in the world, or some other airplanes. And during the last decades they were struggling for even funding from the state, etc. I think there is now this trend to, because for Ukrainians it's a very unusual thing to consider. In this way we are, I think, in some extent close to Americans. Like, we are mistrustful to any government, we are mistrustful to any public institutions, but there is a certain point at which this mistrust should stop, and in which we should understand that the private interest, private actors cannot really change everything.
It's interesting that you're mentioning the United States. There's another challenge. It's a security vacuum. It's unfortunately increasing. Of course, we already talked about the war in eastern Ukraine, Crimea, but also Belarus. So perhaps you can tell us why Ukraine is like a key factor in the question of security for Europe, even when nowadays we have other terrible stories we can see in Afghanistan, for example. But why Ukraine plays this important role, in your opinion?
Well, the parallel with Afghanistan is very simple. The Afghan case shows that if the big Western powers disengage from certain region very quickly, it can lead to disaster. It can lead to total disaster in terms of security, in terms of human security, in terms of the stability in the region, etc. Why Ukraine is important? Because if you look at the history, you understand clearly that there is a kind of this, shifting balance back and forth, and if Ukraine loses its sovereignty, it opens the way for the Russian Empire. I still call it Russian Empire. To expand, and basically when it is expanding, it's not very good for other countries as well. Look at, for example, at the sorry for these, historical incursions, but it's very important to understand this moment from the wider perspective. In the early 18th century, this famous Poltava battle, when the Swedish king Charles XII lost the battle against Peter I, and Charles was assisted by Ukrainian hetman Ivan Mazepa and his Cossacks. So this was the start of the end of Ukrainian statehood in the Russian Empire, because it immediately led to curbing the Ukrainian autonomy, and finally during the reign of Catherine II, closer to the end of the 18th century, it led to the complete demolition of Ukrainian autonomy in the Russian Empire. But what were the consequences of that for other states? For example, there were Russian-Turkish war and the first annexation of Crimea in 1774. We should not forget about that as well. So this was kind of a starting of the end, starting this process of Russian forcing the Crimean Tatars out of the peninsula, the late 18th century. But then you look at Poland, the three partitions of Poland and the disappearance of Poland from the political map of Europe started precisely in these years, 1770s. So imagine if, for example, Charles and Mazepa win the Poltava battle, probably we would see a complete different Central and Eastern Europe. For example, with much more of this Western civilization, maybe more these Protestant individualist values that would have been brought by the Swedes, etc. Or look, for example, at the 20th century. As I told you initially, Ukraine was able to keep its independence in the 20s and the 30s. It didn't. Out of all the empires that collapsed, Russian Empire was the only one to rebuild itself with the Soviet Union. What happened next? The Soviet Union finally declared a clandestine war on Ukraine, killed at least 4 million people in Holodomor in 32, 33. It exterminated all Ukrainian intelligentsia, absolutely, like 90% of writers, painters, musicians were killed in the Soviet camps. And Stalin was actually very afraid of Pilsudski Poland entering Ukraine and kind of using Ukrainian movement to destabilize Soviet Union. So the first thing he was thinking of in the late 30s is how to invade Poland, and that was basically the reason for the Second World War. The Nazi and Stalin's invasion of Poland. Oh, everybody knows this history. Imagine if Ukraine succeed in the 20s and 30s to keep its independence. Maybe we could have a situation when Soviet Union would not at least invade the Eastern Central Europe from the east. And then you know the story that Soviet Union occupied Central Europe, including half of the Germany, and then we had Cold War. So it's really important to look at things at perspective and to understand that Ukrainian struggle is not only Ukrainian struggle. It is very interlinked globally.
Into Europe's history.
Exactly.
It's interesting that you mentioned Mazepa, because it seems that it's like what is on the rise also in the cultural sphere. I been recently to Moscow and saw the opera by Tchaikovsky in the Bolshoi Theater. So they staged it in Moscow, but also in Berlin. They have this production. So it seems that it's quite a figure that is now on the rise and also in terms of discussing history between Russia and Ukraine.
I can tell you, if it's not too boring, but I can tell you very interesting things about this story, because on the one hand, Mazepa is a part of the European cultural history, because you have a poem by Byron, you have a poem by Victor Hugo on Mazepa, you have a wonderful symphonic poem by Ferenc Liszt on Mazepa, but it was the image of a kind of a heroic, a knight, a warrior, and a Don Juan. Mazepa was in this. Then you have Pushkin and his Poltava, and after which the Tchaikovsky made his opera. When Mazepa, of course, it's a part of the Russian propaganda, cultural propaganda. Let's be serious, because Pushkin was creating this image of Mazepa as a kind of political traitor, but also the traitor of his friends, but also kind of I would say sexually perverse person, because an old man trying to seduce a young lady. But in the Russian literature, you have a person like Kondratij Ryleyev, was one of those Decembrists in the early 19th century, who made this one of the most important uprisings, Republican uprisings in St. Petersburg against the Tsarist regime. It was a chance that Russia missed to democratize in 1825. And then you have afterwards the whole century of oppressing authoritarian Russian state. So it's also like cycles. And Ryleyev has a poem, one of the poems, in which he celebrates Mazepa as a fighter against autocracy. So you see, even in Russian literature, there is this debate, very interesting debate. Because Ukrainians, for Russian liberals, were always an example of fight against autocracy.
Now, at the very end, let's talk about the challenges. One challenge is obviously Crimea. 2 days ago, the Crimean platform took place. So President Zelensky managed to invite 46 representatives of states, 14 heads of state that signed a declaration. But there were other challenges. Perhaps you can tell us at the very end which challenges they are and how Ukraine tackles them.
Well, coming back to your previous question about security vacuum, I think it's indeed a security vacuum, and it's getting worse, unfortunately, because sometimes we ask what can be worse than 2014 when Ukraine was a target of invasion. Well, the situation is getting worse for Ukraine. Why? Because, as you mentioned, Ukraine is encircled right now. It has a challenge from the east and from the north, from the Russian Federation. It has a challenge from the south because Crimea has become a military base. Let's be honest here. It's become a huge military base, even with signs of, deploying nuclear weapons. And Crimea is a kind of can be epicenter for Russia to influence the Black Sea, but also the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Southern Europe, everything you want, and of course Ukraine. And in the current circumstances, with this horrible regime in Belarus, which is just absolutely incredible, it's much more horrible even than Russian regime. Although the difference is that Belarusians, Lukashenko is not an empire which is expanding into foreign countries. But for its citizens, I think it's even worse. But we now have this situation when if Belarus loses its sovereignty, and there are clear signs that it can do that, and that this union state will be created in which Russia will, of course, play the major role, then we will have Russian troops or Belarusian troops administered from Moscow on Belarusian-Ukrainian border in the north. So Ukraine is encirculated north, east and south, and it's very dangerous. The Nord Stream stories were also very dangerous because if Ukraine loses its export capacity of Russian gas to Europe, then Russia would say, well, we can attack it in any time. We are not interested anymore in this gas pipeline because there is no Russian gas there. So Nord Stream also poses security risks for Ukraine. In this situation, Ukraine needs to act, and it's very good that it is acting. So the idea of Crimea platform is first really to bring the Crimea issue from the silence, from the silence that was around it, because everybody was talking about Donbass, and rightly so. But Minsk agreements are related to Donbass, to eastern Ukraine, not to Crimea. And it's very important to raise this Crimea issue to the global agenda, because that was the starting point, this, brutal, blatant violation.
So very late, almost 8 years after.
Yeah, because on the one hand, well, at least it's better late than never, right? So I think everybody was so preoccupied with the eastern Ukraine, and now we understand that, many people understood initially that it was probably the story for decades, because we looked at Transnistria, we looked at South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia. We understood that there is no quick solution as far as Putin's regime in Russia is there. So Ukraine tries to act and to bring the Crimea issue back. But the second very important thing is that Ukraine shows that it is active, that it can be a place for international fora, that it can invite, indeed there were all the member states of the European Union present, all the member states of NATO present, NATO itself as an institution at the higher level, European Union with the President of European Council, Council of Europe, many other institutions and states. I think it's very important. At the same time, there was this wonderful Kiev summit of the first ladies and gentlemen, organized by the First Lady, Ukrainian First Lady. And it is also important, I think, because they are raising these global issues like climate change, post-pandemic world, public health, education. So Ukraine tries to speak to the world with its language, not only because in the coming years Ukraine was only speaking about itself, mostly. Of course, being endangered, it's understandably so, but right now it tries to speak with the world and tries to also to find its contribution to the world problems, and it's very important. So the challenges are like that, but I think what is fantastic about Ukraine is that there is this feeling that tomorrow will be better than today. I think in many countries of the world are lacking this feeling right now. So we are probably not very rich, not very secure, but there is this feeling that tomorrow is better than today or yesterday. I think this is the most fantastic thing.
Volodymyr, thank you very much for bringing
My
us
pleasure.
the story of Ukraine and talking about the challenges and what Ukraine means to the world. And for all of you who want to follow the next talks, just press the button and then you will be informed of when the next talk is being uploaded. Thank you so much. Thank you, Volodymyr.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.